England, 1187. Part 1. The Fall of Sir Alaric. The tale of Sir Alaric begins in a grand and ancient castle perched atop the rolling hills of southern England. The castle, with its towering stone walls and turrets, stands as a formidable bastion against the turbulent world outside. Within these walls, life moves with the rhythm of medieval nobility, echoing footsteps of armored knights, the bustling activity of servants in the courtyards, and the ever-present scent of hearth fires warming the vast, drafty halls. Sir Alaric, a man of considerable stature and renown, is a knight whose name is spoken with reverence throughout the kingdom. His reputation as a warrior of unmatched skill precedes him, earned through countless battles fought in the name of his king and his god. Clad in armor that gleams like the morning sun, Alaric embodies the ideals of chivalry, his heart bound by the principles of honor, loyalty, and faith. Yet, behind the imposing exterior of the knight lies a man deeply in love with his wife, Lady Helena. Helena, known for her grace and kindness, is the light of Alaric's life. Their love is the stuff of ballads, pure and unwavering, a beacon of hope in a world often darkened by war and strife. Helena, with her delicate features and gentle smile, is beloved by all who know her, her presence bringing warmth to the cold stone walls of the castle. But fate is cruel, and the idol of their life is shattered when Helena falls gravely ill. The illness comes without warning, a shadow that creeps into their lives and refuses to leave. The castle, once filled with the sounds of laughter and music, now echoes with the silence of despair. Alaric, who has faced countless enemies on the battlefield, finds himself powerless against this unseen foe. Day after day, he sits by Helena's side, watching as the illness drains the color from her cheeks and the strength from her body. He prays fervently, his hands clasped tightly around the rosary she had given him on their wedding day. The chapel becomes his refuge, a place where he seeks solace in the presence of the Almighty. Yet, as the days turn into weeks and Helena's condition worsens, Alaric begins to feel the first cracks in his faith. The castle's walls seem to close in on him, the weight of helplessness pressing down like a suffocating shroud. Alaric's once steady hands now tremble as he prays, his voice growing hoarse from the constant supplication. He calls upon every saint, every relic, seeking a miracle that never comes. The knights who serve under him, once inspired by his unshakable resolve, now see a man who is breaking, his spirit crushed by the impending loss of the woman he loves. One stormy night, when the wind howls through the castle's corridors and the rain lashes against the stained glass windows, Lady Helena breathes her last. Her death is as gentle as her life, a soft sigh, a final exhale that seems to take with it the very soul of Sir Alaric. He is left clutching her lifeless hand, his heart shattered, his world turned to ash. The knight who once stood tall against the fiercest of enemies now crumbles, his knees hitting the cold stone floor as he cries out in anguish. In the days that follow, the castle becomes a tomb of memories. The servants move quietly, their eyes cast down, their hearts heavy with grief for their lord. The chapel, where once Alaric sought refuge, now feels empty, the presence of God distant and unreachable. The rosary that was once a symbol of his faith now lies forgotten, its beads scattered across the floor like so many lost prayers. Unable to bear the sight of the place that holds too many memories, Alaric makes a decision that shocks all who know him. He abandons his title, his lands, and his life as a knight. In the dead of night, with nothing but the clothes on his back, he rides away from the castle that has been his home for so many years. He rides until the sun begins to rise, and he finds himself at the edge of a vast, ancient forest, a place where he hopes to lose himself to escape the pain that now defines his existence. In the heart of this forest, far from the prying eyes of the world, Alaric builds a small hut. It is a simple structure, made of rough-hewn wood and thatch, offering little more than shelter from the elements. Here, he lives as a hermit, forsaking the world he once knew. The forest becomes his sanctuary, its towering trees and dense underbrush a barrier between him and the life he left behind. The days pass in solitude. The only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. Alaric spends his time in silence, his thoughts a constant whirl of grief and regret. He no longer prays, no longer seeks comfort in the words of the scriptures. His faith, once the cornerstone of his life, is now a crumbling ruin, buried beneath the weight of his loss. Yet, even in his isolation, the memory of Lady Helena lingers. Her voice, her touch, her smile. They haunt his dreams and fill his waking hours with a sorrow that seems endless. Alaric had once believed in a divine plan, in the idea that all things happened for a reason. But now, all he sees is the randomness of fate, the cruelty of a world that took from him the one thing he cherished most. And so, Sir Alaric, once a knight of great renown, becomes a ghost in the forest, a man who has lost not only his wife but his very sense of self. The world outside moves on, the crusades continue, and the name of Sir Alaric begins to fade from the lips of men. But in the depths of the forest, a broken man clings to the last remnants of his shattered soul, waiting for a salvation he no longer believes will come. Part 2. The Call to Arms. Years passed in the dense, shadowed heart of the forest, where Sir Alaric had chosen to exile himself from the world. The seasons changed, yet to Alaric, time seemed to stand still, each day blending into the next in a monotonous cycle of survival. The once great knight, who had led armies into battle, now spent his days in solitude, the sound of his own footsteps the only company he allowed himself. The forest was a place of ancient, unyielding beauty, where the towering trees formed a canopy so thick that the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. The air was always cool, carrying the earthy scent of moss and damp leaves. Alaric's hut, small and humble, was nestled near a stream that wound through the trees, its gentle babbling a constant, soothing presence. This stream was his lifeline, providing him with fresh water and a place to catch fish, the only sustenance he allowed himself in his self-imposed penance. Alaric had become a man of few words, his once commanding voice now rarely used. His thoughts were consumed by memories of Lady Helena and the life they had shared. Each day, he would walk through the forest, retracing the same paths over and over, as if hoping that one day, those paths might lead him back to the past, to a time when he was whole. He had abandoned his faith along with his sword, no longer praying or seeking solace in the divine. The chapel where he once knelt in prayer now felt like a distant dream, a place that belonged to another life. But the world outside the forest had not forgotten Sir Alaric, nor had it remained idle. The Crusades, a series of holy wars sanctioned by the Church, continued to rage across the Holy Land. Tales of battles won and lost, of territories gained and ceded, filled the courts of Europe, and in the north, far from Alaric's secluded forest, a new threat began to rise. A pagan force that swept through the land like a plague, leaving devastation in its wake. The king of Alaric's land, a devout man who had once fought alongside him, received word of this threat with growing alarm. His knights were valiant, but the enemy was cunning, their strategies unlike any the king had faced before. The king knew that only one man had the experience, the skill, and the leadership to turn the tide of this war, Sir Alaric. Yet, the king also knew that Alaric had abandoned his life as a knight, retreating into the forest and disappearing from the world. Desperate, the king sent his most trusted knights to seek out the fallen hero, hoping that Alaric's sense of duty would bring him back to the fight. It was late autumn when the knights finally reached the forest. The leaves had turned to shades of red and gold, and the air carried the first hints of winter's chill. Alaric was out gathering firewood when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. His heart, which had long been numb, stirred with a faint sense of recognition. He knew those sounds, the clinking of armor, the heavy breathing of war horses. But he did not turn to greet them. Instead, he continued his work, hoping that if he ignored them, they would leave him in peace. The knights, however, were persistent. They rode into the clearing where Alaric's hut stood, their eyes scanning the area until they found him. The leader of the group, a knight who had once served under Alaric's command, dismounted and approached him with a mixture of respect and urgency. The knight's voice was firm, but tinged with the desperation of a man who had no other options. "Sir Alaric," the knight began, but Alaric cut him off with a sharp gesture, his eyes cold and distant. "I am no longer Sir Alaric," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "That man died with his wife." The knight, undeterred, continued, "The king has sent us to find you. The kingdom is in grave danger. The pagans are advancing, and we have no one who can lead us to victory. We need you." Alaric's hands tightened around the bundle of wood he carried. He could feel the weight of the knight's words, the pull of his old life, but he resisted. "You have come in vain," he replied. "I am no longer a knight. I have no interest in your wars." The knight looked at Alaric with a mixture of pity and frustration. He had expected resistance, but he had hoped that the man who had once inspired him on the battlefield would still have some spark of that fire left. "The king believes in you," the knight pressed. "He remembers the man you were, the knight who fought for God and for justice. He believes that man still exists." Alaric's face remained impassive, but inside, the knight's words struck a chord. Memories of battles fought, of men saved, of the cause he once believed in, began to surface, unbidden. But he pushed them back, burying them deep. "The man you speak of is gone," he said, turning away from the knight. "Tell the king that I am dead to him." The knight hesitated, sensing that there was more at play here than simple refusal. "Sir Alaric," he said softly, "what happened to you was a tragedy, but it is not the end. You can still make a difference. You can still be the man your wife believed you to be." At the mention of his wife, Alaric's composure cracked. He turned back to the knight, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and pain. "Do not speak of her," he growled. "You know nothing of what I have lost." The knight took a step back, recognizing the depth of Alaric's grief. "I know that she would not want you to live like this," he said gently. "She would want you to fight, to protect the innocent, just as you always have." For a long moment, there was silence between them, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the wind. Alaric felt the weight of the knight's words, the truth in them that he did not want to acknowledge. But the pain of losing Helena was still too raw, too overwhelming. He could not go back to that life, not when every step would remind him of what he had lost. Without another word, Alaric turned and walked away, leaving the knights standing in the clearing. They watched him go, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they had failed in their mission. But as they mounted their horses to leave, the leader of the group looked back at the hut one last time. He knew that the seed of doubt had been planted in Alaric's mind, and he could only hope that it would grow. That night, as Alaric lay in his small, cold bed, he could not sleep. The knight's words echoed in his mind, stirring memories that he had long tried to forget. He thought of Lady Helena, of her gentle voice and the way she had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. He thought of the knights who had once fought by his side, their lives often in his hands, trusting him to lead them to victory. And he thought of the kingdom he had once sworn to protect, now facing a threat that he alone could stop. As the hours passed, Alaric found himself rising from his bed and kneeling on the floor. It had been years since he had prayed, but now, in the darkness of his hut, he whispered a prayer to God, asking for guidance. The words felt strange on his lips, unfamiliar after so long, but as he spoke them, he felt a warmth begin to spread through his chest, a warmth he had not felt since Helena's death. And then, as he closed his eyes, he saw her. Lady Helena, bathed in a soft, golden light, her face serene and full of love. She reached out to him, and in that moment, Alaric knew that she had never truly left him. She had been with him all along, guiding him, waiting for him to find his way back. When Alaric awoke the next morning, He felt a sense of clarity that he had not known in years. He knew what he had to do. With a steady hand, he retrieved his armor from where it had been left to rust and began the slow, meticulous process of cleaning and repairing it. His sword, buried deep in the earth, was unearthed and polished until it gleamed like new. And when he was done, he stood before the small altar he had built in his hut, his wife's rosary in his hand, and prayed once more. This time, his prayer was not one of desperation, but of resolve. He prayed for the strength to do what needed to be done, for the courage to face the demons of his past, and for the faith to believe that he could make a difference. When he stepped out of his hut and into the forest, the air was crisp and clean, the sun shining through the trees. The knights were waiting for him at the edge of the clearing, their faces a mix of surprise and relief as they saw him approaching, fully armored, his sword at his side. "I will fight," Alaric said, his voice strong and clear, "but not for the king and not for glory. I will fight for my wife, for the memory of the woman who believed in me when I could not believe in myself. And I will fight for the innocent, for those who cannot fight for themselves." The knights nodded, understanding the weight of Alaric's words. Together, they rode out of the forest, Alaric leading the way, his heart no longer burdened by grief, but filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, the battle still to be fought, but for the first time in years, Alaric felt the light of his faith guiding him forward. The knight had returned, not as the man he once was, but as a man reborn, ready to face whatever lay ahead. And as they rode towards the king's court, the trees parting to reveal the open fields beyond, Alaric knew that his journey was just beginning. Part 3. The Return of the Knight. Sir Alaric's return to the world he had abandoned was a moment of profound significance, both for himself and for those who had once followed him into battle. The journey from the depths of the forest to the king's court was long and arduous, but each step seemed to renew his sense of purpose. The forest, with its towering trees and dark shadows, gradually gave way to open fields and bustling villages, where the presence of Sir Alaric caused a stir among the people. As he rode through the countryside, clad in his restored armor, Alaric noticed the changes that had taken place in his absence. The villages were smaller, many of the homes now in disrepair, a testament to the toll that the ongoing wars had taken on the kingdom. Fields that had once been fertile and bountiful were now barren, left untended as more and more men were called to fight. The people, once full of hope, now carried an air of weariness, their eyes dull and their spirits broken. Yet, as they saw Alaric ride past, there was a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of the hope that they had all but lost. The king's court was a place of stark contrasts, opulence and decay, wealth and poverty, power and fear. The castle, once a symbol of strength and prosperity, now bore the marks of the kingdom's struggles. The walls, though still imposing, were weathered and cracked, and the banners that once flew proudly were faded and tattered. The knights who stood guard, though loyal, carried the weight of years of conflict on their shoulders. When Alaric arrived at the gates, the guards stared in disbelief. Word of his return had spread quickly, but few had believed it until they saw him with their own eyes. The gates were thrown open, and Alaric was led through the courtyard, where the king's knights and courtiers gathered to catch a glimpse of the man who had once been their greatest champion. The king, a man who had aged considerably since Alaric had last seen him, sat upon his throne in the great hall, surrounded by his advisors and generals. His once sharp eyes were now clouded with the burden of leadership in a time of war, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the scepter of his office. Yet, when he saw Alaric enter the hall, a spark of the old fire returned to his gaze. "Sir Alaric," the king said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and desperation, "you have returned to us in our time of greatest need." Alaric knelt before the king, his armor clinking softly as he bowed his head in respect. "Your Majesty," he replied, his voice steady and strong, "I have returned, not for glory or for riches, but to fulfill the duty that I once swore to uphold. I will lead your armies, but I do so for the sake of the people, for the memory of my wife, and for the honor of the God we both serve." The king nodded, his expression one of profound gratitude. He rose from his throne and placed his hand on Alaric's shoulder, a gesture that spoke of the bond they once shared as brothers in arms. "Then rise, Sir Alaric, and take your place as the leader of my armies. The enemy is strong, but with you at the helm, I believe we can turn the tide of this war." As Alaric rose, the courtiers and knights around him erupted in cheers. It was as if the very presence of their once great leader had reignited their hope, the belief that victory was still within their grasp. Alaric, however, remained solemn. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, and that many would not live to see the end of the coming battle. But he also knew that he could not turn away from the path that lay before him. In the days that followed, Alaric set about the task of preparing the king's forces for the coming conflict. He toured the barracks, inspecting the troops, speaking with the knights, and ensuring that every man was ready for the battle that would soon come. He drilled them relentlessly, pushing them to their limits, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. He knew that the enemy they faced was unlike any they had encountered before, cunning, ruthless, and determined to see the kingdom fall. Yet, even as he prepared for war, Alaric could not shake the memories of his time in the forest. The solitude, the quiet, the peace that he had sought and never truly found. He would often retreat to the chapel in the castle, where he would kneel before the altar and pray for guidance. His prayers were different now, not filled with the desperation of a man lost, but with the resolve of a man who had found his purpose once more. One evening, as the sun set over the castle and the shadows grew long, Alaric stood on the battlements, overlooking the land he had sworn to protect. The fields below were filled with tents, the soldiers preparing for the march to the battlefield. The sight filled him with a sense of determination, but also with a deep sorrow. He knew that many of these men would not return, that they would give their lives in a cause that they believed in, even if they did not fully understand it. It was then that a figure approached him, one of the king's advisors, an older man who had served the kingdom for many years. He was a man of wisdom and insight, one whom Alaric had always respected. The advisor stood beside Alaric, gazing out over the same scene. "You have done well, Sir Alaric," the advisor said, his voice calm and measured. "The men are ready, and the king's faith in you is stronger than ever." Alaric nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "if all of this is truly what God desires? If the blood we shed, the lives we take, are in service of a greater good, or if they are merely the result of our own pride and ambition?" The advisor was silent for a moment, considering Alaric's words. "There are no easy answers to such questions," he replied. "But I believe that as long as we act with honor, with a true heart, and with faith in the Lord's guidance, we can find peace in the knowledge that we have done our best." Alaric sighed, his heart heavy with the weight of his doubts. "I once believed that with all my heart," he said, "but now I am not so sure. I have seen too much, lost too much. I fear that I may never find the peace I seek." The advisor placed a hand on Alaric's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and understanding. "Peace is not something that can be found in the world," he said softly. "It is something that must be found within. And I believe that you, Sir Alaric, will find it in time." Alaric remained silent, but the words resonated within him. He knew that the battle ahead would be his greatest test, not just of his strength and skill, but of his faith and his resolve. And as he stood there, looking out over the land he had sworn to protect, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The doubts, the fears, the uncertainties, they were still there, but they no longer held the power they once had. As the night fell and the stars began to appear in the sky, Alaric turned away from the battlements and made his way back to the chapel. There, in the quiet of the evening, he knelt before the altar once more, his hands clasped in prayer. And for the first time in many years, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose that went beyond the battle, beyond the war. It was a peace that came from within, from the knowledge that he was on the right path, that he was doing what he was meant to do. The following day, the army gathered in the courtyard, ready to march. The knights, clad in their shining armor, mounted their horses, their banners flying high in the morning breeze. The soldiers, with their swords and shields, stood in formation, their faces set with determination. And at the head of them all was Sir Alaric, his lance held high, his gaze fixed on the horizon. As the gates of the castle opened and the army began to move, a cheer rose up from the people who had gathered to watch them depart. They cheered for their king, for their knights, but most of all, they cheered for Sir Alaric, the man who had returned to lead them to victory. The journey to the battlefield was long and arduous, the roads rough and the weather unforgiving. But Alaric led his men with a steady hand, his presence a source of strength and inspiration. The soldiers followed him without question, their faith in him unwavering. They knew that with Sir Alaric at their head, they had a chance, a hope of victory that had seemed impossible before. As they neared the battlefield, the tension in the air grew palpable. The enemy was close, their presence felt in the very ground beneath their feet. Alaric could see the fear in the eyes of his men, could feel the weight of their expectations resting on his shoulders. But he did not waver. He knew that this was his destiny, that everything he had been through had led him to this moment. The night before the battle, Alaric gathered his knights around him in the camp. The firelight flickered in their eyes as they listened to him speak. His voice calm, and Alaric gathered his knights around him in the camp. The firelight flickered in their eyes as they listened to him speak, his voice calm and steady. He spoke not of glory or victory, but of duty, honor, and faith. He reminded them that they fought not just for their king or their land, but for something greater, a cause that transcended the battle itself. As he looked into the faces of the men who had followed him through so much, Alaric felt a deep sense of responsibility. These were not just soldiers. They were his brothers, men who had placed their lives in his hands. He knew that the battle ahead would test them all, that many would not return. But he also knew that they would fight with everything they had, for each other and for the faith that bound them. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the army took its final steps towards the battlefield. The land was flat and barren, the ground hard beneath their feet. In the distance, they could see the enemy, a dark mass of warriors stretching as far as the eye could see. The sight was enough to strike fear into the hearts of even the bravest men, but Alaric felt only a calm determination. He raised his lance, the signal for his men to prepare for battle. The knights formed up behind him, their armor gleaming in the morning light, their banners snapping in the wind. The soldiers, their swords and shields at the ready, took their places in the ranks. And as the two armies faced each other across the field, a hush fell over the land, the calm before the storm. The enemy began to move, a wave of warriors surging forward with a roar that echoed across the battlefield. But Alaric held his ground, waiting for the right moment. He could see the determination in the eyes of his men, could feel their faith in him, and it gave him strength. He knew that they were ready, that they would follow him wherever he led. And then, with a cry that pierced the air, Alaric led the charge. His lance held high, he urged his horse forward, the knights following close behind. The ground shook beneath the pounding hooves, the sound of steel clashing with steel filled the air. The battle had begun. The fight was fierce, the enemy relentless, but Alaric fought with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him. His lance struck true, again and again, cutting through the enemy ranks like a blade through water. Around him, his knights fought with equal ferocity, their faith in their leader driving them to greater heights of bravery. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the enemy was not invincible. They had not counted on the strength of the knights, the resolve of the soldiers, or the unwavering faith of the man who led them. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The enemy, once so confident in their victory, began to falter, their ranks breaking before the might of Sir Alaric and his men. But even as the enemy retreated, Alaric knew that the battle was far from over. There was still much to do, many lives to save, and he would not rest until the field was won. With every strike of his lance, every swing of his sword, he fought not just for victory, but for the memory of his wife, for the faith that had brought him back from the brink, and for the men who fought beside him. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the battle was nearly won. The enemy was in full retreat, their will broken by the relentless onslaught. But Alaric did not relent. He pushed forward, driving the enemy from the field, his men following close behind. And when the last of the enemy had fled, leaving the battlefield in the hands of the victors, Alaric finally lowered his lance. The battle was over, but the war was not yet won. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But in that moment, as he stood among his men, their cheers ringing in his ears, Alaric felt a sense of peace. He had done what he had come to do. He had led his men to victory, not just with his sword, but with his faith. And as he looked out over the battlefield, the bodies of the fallen lying in the dust, Alaric knew that he had found his purpose once more. The knight had returned, not as the man he once was, but as a man reborn, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The battle was over, but the journey of Sir Alaric was far from finished. He had been tested, and he had prevailed. But the path ahead was still uncertain, and the challenges he would face would require more than just strength of arms. They would require strength of spirit, of faith, and of heart. And as Alaric prepared to lead his men back to the king's court, he knew that he would face those challenges with the same determination that had brought him back from the brink. For he was Sir Alaric, the knight who had returned, not just to lead his men to victory, but to find his place in the world once more. Part 4. The Battle for the Kingdom. The day of the decisive battle dawned under a sky heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of the conflict to come. The battlefield stretched out before Sir Alaric, a vast expanse of trampled earth and scattered stones. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and the distant sound of birds calling, oblivious to the human drama about to unfold beneath them. Alaric stood at the forefront of his army, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The landscape was bleak and unforgiving, the perfect setting for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom. To the west, a line of low hills rose like sentinels, their slopes dotted with the twisted remains of trees long felled by storms. To the east, the ground dipped into a shallow valley, where a river meandered lazily, its waters dark and slow. The army under Alaric's command was a formidable sight. The knights, clad in their shining armor, formed the vanguard, their banners fluttering in the breeze. Behind them, ranks of foot soldiers stood ready, their swords and shields gleaming in the dim light. The archers, positioned on the hills, had their bows strung and arrows nocked, waiting for the signal to unleash a deadly rain upon the enemy. But it was not just the physical strength of his forces that gave Alaric confidence. It was the faith that had been rekindled within him, the belief that he was fighting for something greater than himself, something that transcended the battlefield. His thoughts turned to Lady Helena, the memory of her love and her belief in him strengthening his resolve. He could almost feel her presence beside him, a comforting whisper in the wind that brushed against his face. As the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Alaric's scouts returned with news that the enemy was approaching. The pagan forces, a fearsome horde that had swept across the land with brutal efficiency, were now only a few miles away. The tension in the air grew palpable, the soldiers shifting uneasily as they prepared for the coming clash. But Alaric's presence was a calming influence, his composure and quiet strength reassuring those who looked to him for guidance. With a final prayer for strength, Alaric mounted his horse and rode along the lines of his men, offering words of encouragement and reminding them of the righteousness of their cause. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also the determination, the fire that had been kindled by his leadership. These men would follow him to the ends of the earth, and Alaric knew that he could not fail them. The moment came when the enemy forces appeared on the horizon, a dark wave of humanity surging towards them. The pagan warriors, clad in furs and iron, wielded crude but deadly weapons, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. They were a terrifying sight, their sheer numbers overwhelming, but Alaric did not waver. He raised his lance high, signaling his men to prepare for the charge. The two armies met with a thunderous crash, the sound of steel against steel ringing out as the knights clashed with the pagan warriors. Alaric was at the center of the fray, his lance a blur as he struck down one enemy after another. The battle was fierce and chaotic, a whirlwind of movement and sound, but Alaric's training and experience guided him through the storm. He fought with the strength of 10 men, his blows precise and lethal, driven by a fervor that came from deep within his soul. As the battle raged on, Alaric found himself separated from his men, surrounded by a group of enemy warriors. They circled him like wolves, their eyes gleaming with the anticipation of the kill. But Alaric's heart was filled with a calm certainty, the knowledge that he was not alone. He felt a surge of strength as he invoked the name of God, his voice rising above the din of battle. With a mighty swing of his sword, Alaric cut through the first attacker, his blade cleaving through armor and bone with ease. The others hesitated, momentarily taken aback by the sheer force of his strike, but they quickly recovered, rushing at him from all sides. Alaric's movements were a blur, his sword flashing in the dim light as he parried and struck, each blow landing with deadly precision. The enemy fell before him, one after another, until the ground around him was littered with their bodies. Despite the carnage, the battle was far from over. The enemy forces continued to press forward, their numbers seemingly endless. Alaric's men fought valiantly, but they were beginning to tire, the weight of the battle taking its toll. Alaric knew that they needed a decisive moment, something that would turn the tide in their favor. It was then that he saw it. A group of enemy warriors attempting to flank his forces, their movements concealed by the terrain. If they succeeded, the entire battle could be lost. Alaric knew that he had to act quickly. With a shout, he rallied a group of knights to his side and charged towards the enemy, his heart pounding with the urgency of the situation. The clash was brutal, but Alaric fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He led his men into the thick of the enemy, cutting through their ranks with the force of a battering ram. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden assault, began to falter. Alaric pressed the advantage, driving them back with relentless determination. The knights at his side fought with equal fervor, inspired by their leader's bravery. As the enemy's flank crumbled, Alaric seized the opportunity to strike a decisive blow. He called for his archers, who unleashed a deadly volley of arrows that rained down upon the enemy's rear lines. The effect was devastating, the enemy forces thrown into disarray as they tried to shield themselves from the onslaught. Alaric's men, emboldened by the turn of events, pushed forward with renewed vigor, their battle cries echoing across the field. The tide of battle had turned. The enemy, once so confident in their numbers, began to retreat, their will to fight broken by the relentless assault. Alaric did not allow them to regroup. He led the charge, driving the enemy from the field with a fury that left no room for mercy. The ground beneath them was soaked with blood, the air thick with the cries of the wounded and dying, but Alaric's focus was unyielding. He fought not just for victory, but for the memory of Lady Helena, for the faith that had brought him back from the brink of despair. As the last of the enemy fled, leaving the battlefield in the hands of Alaric and his men, a great cheer rose up from the ranks. The battle was won, the kingdom saved from the threat that had loomed so large. But Alaric did not join in the celebrations. He stood amidst the fallen, his sword still in hand, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the lives that had been lost. The battlefield was a scene of devastation, the earth churned and scarred by the violence of the conflict. The bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the field, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and fear. Alaric looked upon them with sorrow, knowing that each one had been a son, a brother, a husband, men who had fought and died for a cause they believed in. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Alaric dismounted and knelt on the blood-soaked ground. He prayed for the souls of the fallen, both friend and foe, asking God to grant them peace in the afterlife. He prayed for the families they had left behind, for the kingdom that had been spared, and for the strength to continue the fight should the need arise. But most of all, Alaric prayed for forgiveness, for the lives he had taken, for the doubts he had harbored, for the pain he had caused. He prayed for the peace that had eluded him for so long, the peace that could only come from within. And as he knelt there, the battlefield silent around him, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, a sense of closure that he had not expected. The battle was over, but the journey of Sir Alaric was far from finished. He had been tested, and he had prevailed. But the path ahead was still uncertain, and the challenges he would face would require more than just strength of arms. They would require strength of spirit, of faith, and of heart. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to appear in the sky, Alaric rose from the ground, his resolve renewed. He knew that his journey was far from over, that there were still battles to be fought, still lives to be saved. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. With a final glance at the battlefield, Alaric turned and walked back towards his men, his steps steady and sure. The knight who had returned from the wilderness was now a man reborn, a man of faith and purpose, ready to lead his people into the future. Part 5. The Redemption of Sir Alaric. As the battle concluded and the remnants of the pagan forces fled, Sir Alaric returned to the king's court not as a mere knight, but as a symbol of hope, strength, and divine intervention. The victory was celebrated throughout the kingdom, with people from all walks of life praising Alaric as a hero who had not only saved the kingdom but also rekindled the faith of a nation. Yet, for Alaric, the journey was far from over. His soul still sought the peace that had eluded him since Lady Helena's death. The once weathered castle, which had borne the scars of war, was now in the process of being rebuilt. The king, grateful for Alaric's unwavering loyalty and courage, ordered that the castle be restored to its former glory. Alaric, however, found little solace in the grandeur of stone walls and banners. Instead, his heart was drawn to the people, the villagers, the soldiers, and the families who had been affected by the war. Alaric spent his days walking among the people, helping to rebuild not only their homes but their spirits as well. He was no longer the distant, battle-hardened knight. He was a man who had rediscovered his faith and was determined to share it with others. He would visit the villages, offering words of encouragement, sharing stories of the battle, and reminding everyone that their victory was a testament to their faith in God. One day, as Alaric was helping to rebuild a church in a small village that had been devastated by the war, he felt a familiar presence. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the land, and as he looked up, he saw Lady Helena standing at the edge of the clearing. Her image was ethereal, bathed in the warm light of the setting sun, and for a moment, Alaric's heart ached with longing. But then, as she smiled at him, he felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. It was as if Helena was telling him that she was at peace and that he, too, could find peace by continuing his work, by living a life that honored the love they had shared. Alaric nodded, a silent promise to her and to himself that he would not let his past define him, but instead, he would let it guide him towards a future filled with purpose and faith. The months that followed saw a transformation in the kingdom. The land, once ravaged by war, began to heal, the villages thriving under the protection and guidance of Sir Alaric. The soldiers, who had once followed him into battle, now followed him in peace, helping to rebuild and protect the kingdom they had fought so hard to save. Alaric himself became a beacon of hope, his presence a constant reminder of the power of faith and the strength that could be found in even the darkest of times. He was no longer just a knight. He was a leader, a teacher, and a man of God, The people looked to him not just for protection but for guidance, for wisdom, and for the faith that he had found once more. One evening, as the work on the church neared completion, Alaric stood at the altar, looking out over the pews that would soon be filled with the faithful. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light through the stained glass windows, bathing the church in a heavenly glow. Alaric knelt at the altar, his hands clasped in prayer, his heart filled with gratitude. He thought of Lady Helena, of the journey that had brought him back to his faith, and of the people he had been able to help. His life had been one of hardship and loss, but it had also been a life of redemption, of finding light in the darkest of places. And as he prayed, he felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that he had fulfilled his promise to Helena, to God, and to himself. The church bells began to ring, their sound echoing across the valley, a call to the faithful to gather and give thanks. Alaric stood, his heart light, his soul at peace. He walked to the front of the church, where the villagers had begun to gather, their faces filled with hope and joy. As the service began, Alaric joined in the prayers, his voice strong and clear. And when the time came for him to speak, he did so with the conviction of a man who had found his way back from the brink. He spoke of faith, of love, and of the power of God to heal even the deepest wounds. He spoke of the journey he had taken, the battles he had fought, and the peace he had finally found. As he finished his words, Alaric looked out over the congregation, his heart swelling with love for the people he had come to see as his own. And as the final hymn was sung, he closed his eyes and whispered the words that had guided him through his darkest days, the words that had brought him back to the light. All honor and glory to you, Lord, now and forever. Amen. In that moment, surrounded by his brothers and sisters in Christ, Alaric knew that his journey had come full circle. He had found his way back to God, to the love of his life, and to the peace that he had sought for so long. And as the sun set on the kingdom he had saved, Sir Alaric, the knight who had been lost and then found, knew that he had finally come home. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.